friend the chilling whispers of the Emperor's final thoughts, before the Golden Throne. They called me the Keeper of Silences. For 19 years I had maintained the tertiary archive of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica on Terra, cataloging psychic transmissions deemed too sensitive for general distribution, cross-referencing resonance patterns against approved doctrinal templates, preserving the Emperor's words as filtered through 10,000 years of interpretation. My work was sacred. The priests said my devotion made the archive sing with purity. I believed them. I believed the transmissions I preserved were divine truth, that every word I cataloged brought me closer to His grace. My name is Mira Castellan, third archivist of the Silent Repository, and I want you to understand something before I tell you what I discovered. I did not set out to uncover heresy. I set out to prove my faith was justified. The archive existed in level 40, 3 beneath the Imperial Palace, deep enough that the tremors from surface traffic never reached us, cold enough that breath crystallized in the air despite the heating coils running through the adamantium walls. The temperature was maintained at precisely 11 degrees Celsius, optimal for preserving parchment and vellum without requiring excessive energy expenditure. I knew this because I had read the installation specifications 17 times during my first month of service. Precision mattered. Every detail reflected the Emperor's will made manifest through proper procedure. My days followed the rhythm of the archive's heartbeat. I arrived at the beginning of the 4th hour, before the dawn bells echoed through the palace districts above. The walk from the transit station took 14 minutes, down corridors where maintenance servitors shuffled past on predetermined routes, their augmetic limbs clicking against the stone floors with metronomic regularity. I wore the gray robes of the tertiary order, unmarked except for the silver thread sewn into the left sleeve, 3 parallel lines denoting my rank. My hands were always cold. The archive demanded it. The morning routine never varied. I would enter through the secondary portal, palm pressed against the gene, scanner until the lock disengaged with a pneumatic hiss. The atrium smelled of aged paper and sanctified oils, the preservative compounds we applied to documents older than my bloodline. 47 catalogs lined the eastern wall, each containing indices for specific transmission types, battlefield communications, astropathic relay transcriptions, inquisitorial intercepts, and the ones I specialized in, the resonance records. These were transmissions that, supposedly, carried fragments of the Emperor's consciousness, psychic echoes that had traveled through the warp and been captured by sensitives across the galaxy. My task was to verify their authenticity, ensure proper storage, and mark any anomalies for higher review. I was good at my work, exceptionally good. In 19 years I had processed 1,732 resonance transmissions. I had identified 12 forgeries, flagged 17 corrupted documents for purification, and maintained a flawless accuracy rating according to my quarterly evaluations. The work gave me purpose. Every morning I would recite the litany of preservation before beginning. I am the vessel through which His words endure. I am the guardian of truth against the erosion of time. I serve not for glory but for continuity. In His name, I shall not falter. The archive was my sanctuary. I knew the location of every catalog, could navigate the stacks in complete darkness if required, recognized the texture of parchment from different worlds by touch alone. There were 17 other archivists in the repository, but we worked in isolation, each responsible for our assigned domains. I saw my supervisor, Magister Helm, once every 10 days during review sessions. She was a woman of 83 years, augmetic eyes clicking softly as they focused, her hands steady despite their age. She had trained me when I first arrived terrified and uncertain, barely 22 years old and convinced I would fail the Emperor's test. Doubt is natural, she had told me during my second week, watching me struggle with a particularly damaged manuscript. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Faith is choosing certainty despite the questions. You will see things in these archives that disturb you. Castellan. Transmissions that seem contradictory, records that appear incomplete. Your duty is not to understand everything. Your duty is to preserve everything and trust that those with greater wisdom will interpret correctly. I had clung to those words for 19 years. The daily rhythm was meditative. I would begin by reviewing the previous day's intake, documents delivered via servitor courier from processing stations across Terra. Each transmission arrived in a sealed cylinder marked with classification codes, date stamps, and origin coordinates. I would open them one at a time, scan the contents into my memory, verify the authentication seals, then file them according to the indexing system I had helped refine over 2 decades. The work required absolute concentration. A single misfiled document could corrupt the entire cross-reference matrix, making future research impossible. Lunch was distributed at the 13th hour. Nutri, paste served in regulation portions, supplemented with a vitamin solution to counteract the effects of working in low, light conditions. I ate at my desk, usually while reviewing minor discrepancies in morning filings. The paste tasted like chalk and reclaimed protein, which it was, but complaints were the privilege of those who contributed less to the Imperium's function. I contributed precision. I contributed diligence. I contributed faith. The afternoon brought the more complex work. Cross-referencing new transmissions against historical patterns, identifying thematic connections, marking documents that might be relevant to ongoing inquisitorial investigations. This was where my expertise mattered most. I had developed an instinct for resonance authenticity over the years. Could sense when a transmission's psychic signature felt wrong even before I reviewed the technical analysis. Magister Helm called it a gift. I called it practice. Every transmission supposedly containing the Emperor's voice followed a pattern. The psychic resonance always included 3 elements: the foundational frequency, a harmonic specific to the individual astropath who received it, and what we called the divine marker, a signature that theoretically proved the source was the Golden Throne itself. I had verified thousands of these markers. They looked like mathematical equations to the uninitiated, but I had learned to read them like prose, recognizing the subtle variations that indicated genuine imperial origin versus warp corruption or simple fraud. I trusted the system. The transmissions passed through 17 verification stages before reaching my desk. They were analyzed by tech priests, blessed by sanctioned psychers, reviewed by senior magisters, and certified by officials whose authority derived directly from the Adeptus Administratum's highest echelons. By the time I saw them, they were truth made tangible. The Emperor's will translate it into words I could touch and preserve. My faith was simple. The Emperor protected humanity. The Imperium enacted his will. My work supported that divine machinery. I was a component in something vast and necessary, and that knowledge gave my existence meaning beyond the cold archive and the silent hours spent cataloging words I only partially understood. I lived in a hab unit 6 kilometers from the repository, a single room with a sleeping pallet, a wash basin, and a small shrine where I would recite evening prayers before sleep. The window overlooked a manufacturing district, and I would fall asleep to the sound of machinery, the rhythmic pounding of forge, hammers working through the night shift. The city never slept, neither did the Imperium's purpose. I found comfort in that continuity. This was my life. This was my certainty. I believed every word I cataloged, brought me closer to understanding the Emperor's plan, that the archive I maintained was a sacred trust, that the Imperium's vastness reflected divine intention rather than human ambition. I believed the system was harsh, because mercy would invite destruction, that cruelty was necessary, because the alternative was extinction, that 10,000 years of continuous war proved we faced enemies worthy of absolute hatred. I was wrong about almost everything. The first crack appeared on a morning indistinguishable from any other. I had processed 14 transmissions before noticing it. A routine morning requiring no special attention, nothing that should have triggered scrutiny. The document was labeled Resonance Record Theta 7419, dated from the 4th month of the previous year, received from an astropathic relay station on Mundi. Standard format, proper seals, authentication markers verified across all 17 checkpoints. Nothing unusual except for one detail I almost missed. The transmission purported to contain guidance from the Emperor regarding an emerging threat in the Segmentum Tempestus. The message was brief, as most resonance records were, psychic communication being imprecise across such distances. But when I referenced it against the archive's chronological index, I noticed the same relay station had transmitted an identical message 6 months earlier. Word for word. Psychic signature identical down to the harmonic variations. That should not have been possible. Psychic transmissions are unique by nature. Even if the content is similar, the astropath's imprint changes, the warp currents shift, the divine marker fluctuates. Identical transmissions suggested either perfect duplication, which violated the fundamental principles of warp communication, or something simpler. One transmission was genuine, and the other was copied. I sat at my desk for 11 minutes, staring at both documents laid side by side, checking the seals 3 times, verifying the classification codes against master records, looking for any indication one was marked as a duplicate or reference copy. Nothing. Both were filed as independent. Authentic transmissions received months apart. Both had passed all 17 verification stages. My first instinct was to assume clerical error. Perhaps someone had accidentally processed the same transmission twice. It happened occasionally, usually with older documents being digitized into newer archival formats. I drafted a query to the processing division, marked it routine priority, and prepared to continue my morning work. This was a minor discrepancy, easily explained, nothing that required higher attention, but something made me pause before sealing the query cylinder. I retrieved both documents again and examined them more carefully. The parchment was different. One was standard imperial vellum, pressed at a holy Terra facility according to the watermark. The other was off, world origin, the texture slightly rougher, marked with manufacturing codes from Mundi itself. So these were definitely processed as separate transmissions, not accidental duplicates of the same physical document. The seals were also different. One bore the signature of Magister Valen, who supervised the northern processing station. The other was signed by someone named Castellan, no title listed. A name I did not recognize despite 19 years of familiarity with archive personnel. I checked the personnel directory. No Castellan listed in any processing division. I checked the historical records. No one by that name had worked in the repository during the time frame indicated by the document's date stamp. This meant either the signature was forged, or the document had been processed outside normal channels, or someone had deliberately removed Castellan from all official records after the document's creation. None of those possibilities aligned with proper procedure. I spent the remainder of the morning searching for other instances of duplicate transmissions. I found 3 more within the past year alone, all from different relay stations, all authenticated through standard channels, all containing identical content to earlier transmissions. And in each case, one of the duplicates bore a signature from personnel who either did not exist in current directories or whose records showed they had been terminated before the document's supposed processing date. I did not report this to Magister Helm. Not yet. I told myself I needed more evidence, that presenting incomplete findings would waste her time and demonstrate poor judgment on my part. But truthfully, I was afraid. Afraid of what it might mean if the authentication process was compromised. Afraid of what questions it would raise about every transmission I had verified over 19 years. Afraid most of all that I might discover my faith had been built on procedures that were not as infallible as I had believed. The proper response would have been immediate disclosure. Potential corruption in the authentication chain was a serious matter, possibly indicating tech priest malfunction or, worse, deliberate sabotage. But I hesitated because admitting the system had flaws felt like admitting the Emperor's protection was imperfect. And that thought was heresy of the deepest kind. So I investigated quietly, using my archival access to review older records. Searching for patterns I might have missed, trying to find a rational explanation that would preserve my certainty. I told myself this was due diligence, that thorough research before raising concerns was the mark of a conscientious archivist. In truth, I was desperately hoping to prove my suspicions wrong. The second incident occurred 6 days later. I was reviewing a batch of transmissions from the previous decade, part of a routine audit cycle that happened every 5 years. The documents were stored in the deep archives, sealed chambers requiring authorization from 2 magisters to access. Magister Helm had granted permission without question, trusting my judgment after 19 years of flawless service. The deep archives were cold, temperature maintained at 8 degrees to slow decay, and I worked alone in the silence, opening sealed containers that had not been disturbed in years. The transmission I found was dated 10 years prior, a resonance record claiming to contain the Emperor's tactical guidance during the Verendal Crusade. The crusade had been successful, reclaiming 14 systems from orc infestation, and this transmission had supposedly provided strategic direction that saved millions of Imperial lives. It was one of the archive's prized possessions, cited in dozens of tactical manuals, referenced in training materials for Astra Militarum command staff. But when I opened the container, I found not 1 document, but 7. 6 were identical copies of the celebrated transmission. Perfect duplicates, same parchment, same seals, same authentication markers. The 7th was different. Older parchment, degraded at the edges, bearing the same date stamp and origin codes, but containing completely different content. This version did not contain tactical guidance. It contained a warning. The text was fragmentary, damaged in places, but enough remained to understand the message. The astropath who received it claimed the psychic resonance carried overwhelming grief, described the Emperor's consciousness as fractured and screaming, said the transmission felt less like guidance and more like someone drowning in an ocean of pain. The astropath reported hearing phrases that made no sense. I cannot hold. The throne is a cage. They worship what I am becoming, not what I was, and most disturbing, tell them to let me die. The document's authentication markers were different from the 6 duplicates. Earlier format, using a verification system that had been replaced 8 years ago, and at the bottom, in handwriting I did not recognize, someone had written, original transmission received and verified. Replacement version authorized by Conclave Order 91. This document sealed pending review. Authority, Castellan, 3rd Magister. There was that name again, Castellan. the ghost who signed documents but did not exist in personnel records. I sat in the cold archive for 37 minutes, reading and rereading both versions. The celebrated transmission was clear, confident, tactical. It sounded like how an emperor should sound, commanding and certain, offering strategic wisdom that reflected 10,000 years of battlefield experience. The sealed version sounded like someone in agony, someone begging for release, someone whose consciousness was fragmenting under unbearable strain. One of these was authentic. The other was replacement, and someone with authority high enough to override standard archival protocols had made that substitution. I checked the conclave order referenced in the note. Order 90. One was not in the archive's accessible registry. I searched for 6 hours, checking historical indices, cross-referencing against inquisitorial databases I had limited access to, even reviewing classified protocols I technically should not have been reading. Nothing. Either the order had been expunged from records, or it operated at a classification level beyond my clearance. I wanted to believe there was a legitimate explanation. Perhaps the sealed transmission was corrupted during initial receipt, contaminated by warp interference, and the replacement represented the tech, priest's best reconstruction of the original intent. Perhaps the astropath had been compromised by warp exposure and their report was unreliable. Perhaps Conclave Order 90. One was a legitimate security protocol designed to protect the faithful from psychic contamination that might appear in otherwise authentic transmissions. I wanted to believe these things because the alternative was unthinkable. The alternative was that someone had deliberately replaced an authentic transmission from the Emperor with manufactured content, that the strategic guidance celebrated across the Imperium was fiction, that the real message had been sealed away because its content contradicted the image the Imperium needed to maintain. I spent 3 days trying to rationalize what I had found. I drafted 17 different versions of a report to Magister Helm, each attempting to frame the discovery in terms that did not imply deliberate falsification. But every version felt dishonest, my mind performing gymnastics to avoid the obvious conclusion. I was a woman trained to recognize authenticity, who had built her entire identity around preserving truth, and I was trying desperately not to see what the evidence clearly showed. On the 4th day, I found the pattern. I had expanded my search, reviewing every resonance record in the deep archives, checking for other instances of sealed original transmissions replaced with alternate versions. I worked through the night shifts, surviving on recaf and determination, my hands trembling from cold and exhaustion, but my mind locked on the investigation with intensity that felt almost like prayer. If this was widespread, if multiple transmissions had been altered, then it could not be dismissed as isolated corruption. It would indicate systematic intervention at the highest levels of archival authority. I found 23 additional cases across a 40-year period. 23 original transmissions sealed and replaced with alternate versions. All bore the same authorization note. All referenced Conclave Order 91, and in every case, the sealed original contained content that contradicted imperial doctrine in fundamental ways. The pattern was consistent. The original transmissions portrayed the Emperor as suffering, fragmenting, desperate, or expressing sentiments that undermined the official narrative of his eternal vigilance and guiding consciousness. The replacement versions were clear, commanding, theologically correct. They portrayed an emperor who was transcendent, certain, strategically brilliant, exactly what the Imperium needed him to be. Someone had spent decades systematically removing any evidence that suggested the emperor's consciousness might be deteriorating, that the Golden Throne might be prison rather than salvation, that the being Terra worshipped might be barely coherent rather than divinely omniscient. And I, with my 19 years of flawless service, had been cataloging the lies while the truth remained sealed in containers I was trained never to question. I was sick for 2 days, actually physically ill, vomiting into the wash basin in the Archivist's refresher station, my body rejecting food because my mind could not process what I had discovered. The other Archivists avoided me, assuming I had contracted some minor infection, offering sympathetic nods but maintaining professional distance. I told no one what I had found. I was paralyzed by certainty and terror in equal measure. Because I understood now what I was looking at. This was not corruption. This was not malfunction. This was policy. Someone at a level of authority I could not even conceptualize had made the deliberate decision to falsify the Emperor's words, to manufacture divine guidance that supported imperial doctrine regardless of what the actual transmissions contained. And if this was true of resonance records, what else had been altered? How many of the transmissions I had spent 19 years preserving were authentic? How much of my life's work had been spent cataloging comfortable lies rather than difficult truths? I needed to know the full scope. I needed to understand not just what had been changed, but why, and by whom, and whether anyone else knew. I needed to find Castellan, the ghost magister whose name appeared on authorizations, but not on personnel rolls, who had apparently possessed the authority to override fundamental, archival protocols, and then vanished from all official records. I found her in the Mortality Index. Magister Castellan, 3rd rank, Tertiary Archive Division. Deceased 41 years prior. Cause of death listed as administrative resolution. No further details provided. Her service record showed 38 years in the repository before termination. She had been 63 years old. There was no pension transfer, no memorial notation, no record of her remains being processed through proper mortuary channels. She had simply stopped existing in official documentation 3 days after authorizing the last of the transmission replacements. Administrative resolution. The phrase had specific meaning in administrative terminology. It referred to personnel terminated for cause, usually heresy or gross incompetence, but sometimes applied to individuals whose knowledge made them security risks. Castellan had not been executed for heresy. She had been executed for knowing what the transmissions really said, and I now possessed the same knowledge. I made an appointment to meet with Magister Helm. It took 4 days to arrange, her schedule being perpetually full, and during that time I continued my regular duties with mechanical precision, filing documents and maintaining appearances while my mind churned through implications I could barely comprehend. I ate little. I slept less. I spent the nights in my hab unit staring at the ceiling. Reciting prayers I was no longer certain meant what I had always believed they meant. The meeting occurred at the beginning of the 17th hour. In Helm's office, a space I had visited hundreds of times over the years for routine evaluations and procedural consultations. The walls were lined with reference texts, bound volumes containing authentication protocols and archival standards accumulated over centuries. Her desk was neat, everything aligned with geometric precision, a reflection of the order she maintained in the repository's operations. She sat behind it with her augmetic eyes focused on me, servomotors whirring softly as the lenses adjusted. I had prepared 17 pages of documentation, cross-references, and authentication analysis, laid out in logical sequence to demonstrate the pattern I had discovered. I intended to present the evidence methodically, letting the facts speak for themselves, allowing her to reach the same conclusions I had reached. I wanted her to tell me I was wrong, that I had misunderstood something fundamental, that there was a legitimate explanation that would restore my certainty. Instead, before I could speak, she said, "You have been investigating the sealed transmissions." It was not a question. I sat in the chair across from her desk, my prepared documentation suddenly feeling useless. "How did you know?" "Your access patterns." Her augmetic eyes clicked, refocusing. "You have been reviewing deep archive materials outside your normal audit schedule, cross-referencing historical records against current holdings, accessing personnel databases and mortality indices. These are not standard archival procedures for your rank and assignment. I have been monitoring your activities for the past 8 days, waiting to see if you would bring this to my attention or attempt to conceal what you found." My mouth went dry. I found evidence of systematic falsification. Original transmissions sealed and replaced with manufactured versions. 23 cases across 40 years. Someone has been altering the Emperor's words. She was silent for 11 seconds. Then she reached into her desk and withdrew a data slate, the screen already active, displaying a document I recognized immediately. It was my personnel file, open to the section containing my security, clearance evaluations, and psychological assessments. "You have served with distinction for 19 years, Castellan. Your accuracy rating is perfect. Your dedication is exemplary. You have demonstrated absolute loyalty to the Imperium and unwavering faith in the Emperor's protection. This is why I assigned you to the tertiary archive rather than lesser duties. This is why I trusted you with access to our most sensitive holdings." She set the data slate on the desk between us. "And this is why I am about to share with you information that will require you to make a choice about who you wish to be." I felt something cold settle into my chest. "What choice?" "Whether you can accept that the Imperium's survival sometimes requires us to protect people from truths they are not equipped to process, or whether you will allow your personal crisis of faith to compromise decades of necessary work." She stood and moved to the wall, pressing her palm against a concealed panel that slid aside to reveal a secondary archive space I had never known existed. The chamber beyond was small, perhaps 3 meters square, containing a single shelf with perhaps 30 bound volumes. She removed one and returned to the desk, setting it before me with careful reverence. "What you discovered is not corruption, Castellan. It is doctrine. Not the doctrine we teach to the faithful, but the doctrine we teach to those who must maintain the faith. This is the Codex Administratum Silentis, the silent administration. It contains protocols established during the heresy itself, refined across 10 millennia, governing how we manage information that could undermine imperial stability, if widely known." I stared at the volume. The cover was unmarked black leather, aged but well maintained. "You are saying the falsification is intentional, that altering the Emperor's transmissions is official policy." "I am saying the Emperor's transmissions are complicated." Her augmetic eyes held steady on my face. "You read the sealed versions. You saw what they contained. What would happen if those transmissions were distributed to the faithful? What would occur if every world in the Imperium knew the Emperor speaks of cages and screaming, that he begs for death, that his consciousness is fragmenting after 10,000 years locked in perpetual agony? The truth would destabilize the Imperium." I heard myself saying it, my voice mechanical, stating the obvious conclusion. Destabilization is insufficient as a description. The Imperium would collapse. Not gradually, not over decades, but within months. The faith that holds 1,000,000 worlds together would shatter. The ecclesiarchy would fracture into 1,000 heretical sects. The Astra Militarum would lose the ideological foundation that makes soldiers willing to die in wars they do not understand. Every sacrifice made in the Emperor's name for 10,000 years would be recontextualized as offering suffering to a being who himself suffers beyond measure and gains nothing from their devotion. She opened the codex to a marked page and turned it toward me. This is Protocol 713, Management of Divine Communications. It was established by the first Magisters of the Adeptus Terra, 300 years after the Emperor's interment. They faced the same crisis you now face. The early transmissions were incoherent, filled with pain and confusion, reflecting a consciousness that was clearly degrading rather than ascending to divinity. The faithful needed certainty, needed to believe their Emperor still guided them, still watched over humanity with divine purpose. So the Magisters did what was necessary. They created a system to ensure the transmissions the Imperium received matched the image the Imperium required. I felt something breaking inside me, some foundation I had not known was structural until it began to crack. How many? How many of the transmissions in our archives are authentic? Approximately 37% across the primary collections. The percentage is higher for older transmissions when his consciousness was more coherent, lower for recent decades. She closed the codex. But authenticity is the wrong question, Castellan. The question is utility. The transmissions we distribute serve the same purpose the Emperor serves, maintaining the unity and purpose of the Imperium. Whether his words are exact or interpreted through necessary refinement does not change their function. Their function. I repeated the phrase, tasting how clinical it sounded. You are describing the systematic falsification of the most sacred communications in imperial history as interpretation. I am describing the difference between faith and history. She sat back down, her hands folding on the desk with deliberate calm. Faith requires certainty. History is chaos and contradiction, events without clear meaning, actions without obvious purpose. The Magisters who established these protocols understood that humanity needs the former to survive. We give them certainty. We give them an Emperor who still guides them, even if the truth is more complicated and more terrible than they could bear. I looked at the codex, its black cover promising answers. I now feared would only compound the horror. Show me the original transmissions. All of them. I want to see what you have been hiding. No. The word was flat, final. You do not have clearance for full access, and I will not grant it. What you have already discovered is sufficient to understand the situation. Further exposure serves no purpose except to burden you with knowledge that will not change the fundamental choice before you. What choice? I was barely holding my voice steady. Continue your duties with new understanding, or refuse and face administrative resolution. She did not blink, her augmetic eyes holding me with mechanical patience. These are the only options available. I will not permit you to leave this repository with the knowledge you possess if you are not willing to become part of the machinery that maintains necessary illusions. Too much depends on preserving the faith. I will not allow one archivist's crisis of conscience to undermine millennia of work. The threat was explicit. Continue the lie or be terminated like Castellan, my existence scrubbed from records. My knowledge buried with my body. You do this willingly, I heard myself ask. You falsify sacred transmissions. You lie to billions of faithful. You perpetuate a version of the Emperor that you know is fiction. And you sleep soundly. For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not anger, not defensiveness, but wariness that seemed to age her decades in the space of a breath. I do not sleep soundly. I have not slept soundly in 43 years, since the day I was promoted to Magister and learned what the position actually required. I close my eyes and see the sealed transmissions, the real ones, The Emperor's words unfiltered by interpretation. I hear him screaming. I read his pleas for death. I understand that we are worshipping a being in endless torment who gains nothing from our devotion except the prolongation of his agony. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to something almost like intimacy. But I also understand that without the Imperium, humanity faces extinction. That the moment the faith collapses, 1,000,000 worlds descend into anarchy, and chaos consumes what remains. The Emperor's suffering serves a purpose, even if he does not will it. Even if his consciousness has degraded to the point where he barely understands what he has become. His torment powers the Astronomicon. His agony protects humanity from warp predation. His existence, however terrible, is the foundation of everything we have built. And if maintaining that foundation requires lying about what his transmissions actually say, then I will lie. I have lied for 4 decades. I will lie for 4 more if my body endures. Because someone must be willing to carry this burden, and I will not pass it to another. I stared at her, this woman who had trained me, who had praised my precision, who had seemed to embody everything the Imperium represented. She was not a monster. She was exhausted and uncertain and deeply, horribly human. And that made it worse, because I could see the logic of her position even as I recoiled from its implications. You are asking me to spend the rest of my life cataloging lies. I am asking you to spend the rest of your life preserving the Imperium. She picked up the data, slate, fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. I need your decision now, Castellan. Will you continue your duties with the understanding that your work serves a higher purpose than strict historical accuracy? Or must I implement administrative resolution and find someone else to maintain the archives you have served so faithfully? I thought about 19 years of careful work, of transmissions cataloged with absolute precision, of faith that had given my life structure and meaning. I thought about the Emperor screaming in his prison, consciousness fragmenting across 10,000 years, and how his words had been systematically altered to serve purposes he might not even understand anymore. I thought about Castellan, who had made these same discoveries and been erased for refusing complicity, her name appearing only as a ghost signature on documents authorizing the very falsifications that led to her termination. I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be. I need time, I said finally. Give me 3 days to process this, to reconcile what I believed with what I now know. Then I will give you my answer. She studied me for 17 seconds, augmetic eyes wearing as they focused and refocused, reading my face for signs of deception or flight risk. Then she nodded once. 3 days. You will continue your regular duties during this period. You will not attempt to access the sealed archives again. You will not discuss what you have learned with anyone. And when the 3 days conclude, you will return to this office and tell me whether you can accept the burden of knowledge that comes with your position. I stood, my legs unsteady, and moved toward the door. Before I left, I turned back. The sealed transmissions, the ones that contain his real words. What do they say? What is the worst thing you have read? She was silent for so long I thought she would not answer. Then, that he has forgotten why he agreed to the throne. That consciousness implies continuity of self, and his self has been so thoroughly fragmented by 10 millennia of psychic trauma that the being we worship may not be the same person who fought at the Emperor's side during the heresy. That we are torturing the ghost of a hero and calling it salvation. I left her office and returned to my desk in the archive proper. The temperature was 11 degrees, cold enough to crystallize breath, cold enough to preserve truth, and lies with equal efficiency. I sat and stared at the catalog indices lining the walls. 47 repositories of carefully organized information, and understood finally that precision was not the same as accuracy, that maintaining records was not the same as preserving truth. I worked through the remaining hours of my shift with mechanical efficiency, processing transmissions and filing documents exactly as I had for 19 years. But every authentication marker I verified felt like complicity. Every seal I applied felt like sealing away truth rather than preserving it. Every cross-reference I noted felt like building a cage around reality until only acceptable versions remained. The 3 days passed in a blur of routine work and existential paralysis. I ate little. I slept in fragmented intervals. Dreams filled with parchment that bled when I touched it, and voices screaming in languages I almost understood. I went to the chapel in my hab, block, and knelt before the Aquila, trying to pray, but the words felt hollow. Liturgy directed at an image rather than a being, ritual rather than genuine communion. On the morning of the 3rd day, I made my decision. I would not become what the system required. I would not spend the rest of my life cataloging lies, no matter how necessary those lies might be for imperial stability. I would not file transmissions knowing they had been falsified, would not verify authentications knowing the verification process was designed to conceal rather than reveal. I could not look at the sealed archives and pretend they did not exist. Could not touch the replacement transmissions without feeling the weight of Castellan's ghost. Could not maintain faith in a system that required systematic falsification of its foundational truths. But I also would not flee. Would not attempt to escape Terra and spread what I had learned across the galaxy in some futile gesture of truth, telling that would accomplish nothing except my own destruction. The Imperium's stability, however built on lies, still mattered. Billions of lives depended on the faith remaining intact, on soldiers believing their sacrifices served divine purpose, on citizens trusting that their suffering contributed to something larger than mere human ambition. I would refuse complicity, knowing refusal meant death. I would accept administrative resolution, knowing my knowledge would die with me. But I would die as myself, not as another keeper of necessary lies, not as someone who chose survival over conscience. I returned to Magister Heln's office at the appointed hour. She knew my decision before I spoke. I could see it in the way she stood when I entered, the way her hands remained folded on the desk rather than reaching for the data. Slate. The way her augmetic eyes focused on my face with something that might have been regret. You cannot accept the burden. Again, not a question. No. My voice was steady. I had made peace with this. I cannot catalog lies for the rest of my life, no matter how necessary you believe those lies to be. I cannot file transmissions knowing they have been falsified. I cannot maintain an archive dedicated to preserving a version of the Emperor that serves imperial propaganda rather than historical truth. She nodded slowly. You understand what refusal means. Administrative resolution is not negotiable. You have knowledge that cannot be allowed to spread, and I cannot permit you to leave this repository if you will not become part of the system that maintains imperial faith. I understand, and I did, fully, finally, with clarity that felt almost like grace. I would rather die knowing what I have become than live, pretending I am still what I was. She opened a drawer and removed a last pistol, setting it on the desk between us with the same careful reverence she had used for the Black Codex. Standard administratum issue. The kind given to officials authorized to implement immediate sanctions without trial or appeal. Her hands shook slightly as she placed it. The first sign of physical uncertainty I had seen from her in 19 years. I have implemented Administrative Resolution 40 one times during my tenure as Magister. Her voice was quiet, almost confessional. 41 archivists who discovered what you discovered and refused to accept the necessity of what we do. Each time, I told myself it was required, that protecting imperial stability justified the deaths of individuals who could not reconcile truth with duty. Each time, I wondered if I was right. I have never known. I do not know now. She picked up the pistol, checking the charge with practiced movements, then set it down again. Castellan was the first. I was her assistant when she made the discoveries, when she realized the transmissions had been systematically altered. She brought her findings to the magister above her, expecting commendation for identifying corruption. Instead, she learned it was policy. She refused the same choice I am offering you. She said she would not spend her remaining years cataloging imperial lies, that her faith meant something more than institutional convenience, that the emperor deserved better than to have his words falsified by the very servants who claimed to worship him. The magister above her implemented resolution. I watched her die. I cataloged her termination, and, when the magister retired 3 months later, broken by what the position had required, I accepted the promotion knowing exactly what it would demand of me. She closed her eyes, breathed, opened them again. I do not know if we are right, Castellan. I have lain awake for 4 decades wrestling with the question. Are we preserving the Imperium? Or are we perpetuating a lie that has metastasized into something that can no longer distinguish between protection and oppression? Is the Emperor's suffering necessary for humanity's survival? Or have we built a civilization that requires his torment to function, and called that necessity divine will? I do not know. But someone must maintain the system, and if that someone were to be paralyzed by doubt, the entire structure would collapse. So I act, and I implement resolution against those who refuse to act, and I tell myself inaction would be worse than the terrible certainty of my purpose. She picked up the pistol again, holding it with both hands now, studying it as though seeing it for the first time. You have 3 minutes to change your decision. After that, I will do what my position requires, and you will be added to the mortality index with the same notation that marks Castellan's death. I offer you this time not because I believe you will change your mind, but because I need you to understand that I am not doing this lightly. That your death will weigh on me, as all the others have weighed on me. That I am not a monster, even though the position has required monstrous choices. I sat in the chair across from her desk, my hands folded in my lap, calm spreading through me like cold water. 3 minutes, 180 seconds to reconsider, to choose survival over integrity, to accept that sometimes faith requires lies and that preserving humanity justifies almost any compromise. I do not need 3 minutes. My answer will not change. I looked at the pistol, then at her face, seeing the exhaustion in every line. The weight of 41 previous resolutions reflected in augmetic eyes that had seen too much truth. But I want you to understand something before you do this. I am not refusing because I think you are evil. I am refusing because I cannot become what this position requires without losing the part of myself that makes me human. You have carried this burden for 40 years. You have lied and terminated and filed death notices and told yourself it was necessary. Perhaps it is. Perhaps the Imperium would collapse without people willing to falsify sacred transmissions and murder archivists who refuse complicity. But I would rather die than discover whether you are right. She was silent for 43 seconds. Then she stood, moving around the desk with slow, deliberate steps, the pistol held at her side. She stopped 3 paces away, raising the weapon until it aimed at my forehead with steady precision. Any final statement for the record? Tell my replacement the truth from the beginning. Do not let them serve for 19 years, believing their work preserves divine truth, only to discover it preserves convenient fiction. If you must recruit archivists to maintain this system, give them the choice with full knowledge, rather than luring them in with faith and destroying them with revelation. They deserve that much honesty, even if the Imperium does not. She nodded once. Noted. For what small consolation it offers, Castellan. You served with distinction, and I will remember you as someone who chose integrity over survival. The Imperium needs both types of people. I am the kind who survives. You are the kind who remains human. The pistol discharged with a sound like thunder compressed into a single instant, and my consciousness fragmented into something that felt almost like the sealed transmissions I had rid, awareness splintering across a moment that stretched into eternity. And in that final second, I understood something Magister Helm would never comprehend, that choosing death with dignity was its own form of faith, that sometimes the most profound loyalty was refusing to serve, that the Emperor himself might understand this choice, even if his Imperium could not, and then there was only silence and the cold of the archive and the knowledge that I had remained myself until the end. I am dead now. I have been dead for 3 months, or perhaps 3 minutes. Or perhaps time has no meaning when consciousness exists only as memory stored in words someone might someday read. My body was processed through standard mortuary channels, my remains incinerated and scattered according to protocol. My name added to the mortality index with notation, administrative resolution, and no further details. My HAB unit was sterilized and reassigned. My personal effects were cataloged and disposed of. My work was distributed among remaining archivists who were told I had died of sudden illness. Nothing unusual, just another servant whose service concluded without ceremony or recognition. But before Magister Helm implemented resolution, while I sat in her office waiting for the pistol to discharge, I did one thing she did not notice. I palmed a data wafer from her desk, one of the small storage devices used to transfer documents between archive sections, and I slipped it into my sleeve with movements I had practiced for 19 years while filing and cataloging, small gestures so routine they became invisible. The wafer contained copies of the sealed transmissions, the real ones, the Emperor's actual words unfiltered by institutional convenience. Not all of them. I did not have time or access for that, but 17 of the most damning. 17 transmissions that revealed the truth about what the Golden Throne has become, and what it does to the consciousness imprisoned within it. I left it in my HAB unit, hidden beneath a loose floor panel near the shrine where I used to pray, wrapped in oilcloth with instructions written in chemical ink that will only become visible when exposed to specific solvents. The instructions explain where to take the wafer, which archives to contact, how to verify its authenticity without triggering institutional protocols designed to detect and suppress exactly this kind of evidence. I do not know if anyone will find it. I do not know if whoever inherits my HAB unit will notice the loose panel or investigate what lies beneath it. I do not know if the instructions will be followed, or if the wafer will simply be disposed of as unidentified debris from a deceased archivist's unremarkable life. But I know I made the attempt. I know that I chose conscience over complicity, truth over survival, integrity over the terrible pragmatism that Magister Helm embodies. I know that I died as Mira Castellan, third archivist who refused to catalog lies, rather than living as Mira Castellan, keeper of silences who spent decades maintaining necessary illusions. The Imperium may be right. Perhaps humanity's survival requires systematic falsification of sacred transmissions, requires murdering archivists who refuse complicity, requires building civilization on foundations of convenient lies rather than difficult truths. Perhaps Magister Helm's burden is necessary. Perhaps her 41 resolutions prevented some greater catastrophe. Perhaps the Emperor's suffering serves purposes beyond my capacity to comprehend. But I cannot accept that necessity without question. I cannot touch parchment that bleeds truth and replace it with comfortable fiction without feeling my humanity erode. I cannot file death notices for people like Castellan, like myself, and pretend their terminations served anything except institutional self-preservation. So I made my choice. I accepted death rather than transformation. I preserved my conscience at the cost of my life. And if you are reading this, if you found the wafer and decoded the instructions and verified the transmissions it contains, then you face the same choice I faced. Will you spread this truth and risk the stability of the Imperium, or will you destroy the evidence and preserve the necessary lie? Will you become another keeper of silences, or will you refuse the burden and face your own resolution? I cannot answer for you. I can only tell you what I discovered, what I chose, and what it cost me. The Emperor screams in his prison. His consciousness fragments across 10,000 years of unending torment. His words, when they reach us, speak of cages and desperation and pleas for death that we systematically ignore, because acknowledging them would undermine everything the Imperium has built on the foundation of his suffering. We are worshipping agony and calling it salvation. We are prolonging torture and calling it protection. We are maintaining a system that requires systematic falsification of its most sacred texts because the truth would reveal that our God does not will what we do in his name, that the being we worship may no longer possess sufficient consciousness to will anything at all, that we are offering suffering to someone who gains nothing from our devotion except the prolongation of his own unbearable existence. This is what I learned in Level 40, 3 beneath the Imperial Palace, in archives maintained at 11 degrees to preserve parchment and lies with equal efficiency, during 19 years of faithful service that ended with a pistol discharge and administrative resolution. This is what I am telling you, knowing my words may never be read, knowing that even if they are read, they may be dismissed as the ravings of a heretic or destroyed, as evidence too dangerous to acknowledge, knowing that truth without power accomplishes nothing except to burden the witness with knowledge they cannot use. But I am telling you anyway, because someone must bear witness to what we have become, to the distance between our faith and our reality, to the price we pay for survival and whether that price has become too high to justify. My name was Mira Castellan. I served as third archivist of the Tertiary Archive, Adeptus Astra Telepathica, Level 43, Imperial Palace, Holy Terra. I cataloged transmissions for 19 years with absolute precision and unwavering faith. I believed my work preserved divine truth and brought me closer to understanding the Emperor's will. I was wrong about everything except my capacity to choose who I wanted to be. I chose conscience over complicity. I chose death with dignity over survival through lies. I chose to remain human even when humanity meant refusing to serve. The Imperium called this administrative resolution. I call it the only choice I could make without losing everything that made my service meaningful in the first place. If you find this testimony, if you read these words, if you verify the transmissions and confirm that everything I discovered was true, then you will face the same impossible choice. Spread the truth and risk imperial collapse, or suppress it and become another keeper of necessary lies. I cannot tell you which choice is right. Magister Helm spent 40 years wrestling with that question and never found an answer that brought her peace. Perhaps there is no right answer. Perhaps we are trapped between truths too terrible to speak and lies too comfortable to abandon. But I can tell you this: whatever you choose it with full knowledge of what you are becoming. Do not let yourself serve for 19 years before discovering the nature of your work. Do not let faith blind you to evidence. Do not let procedure substitute for conscience. And if you choose silence, if you destroy this testimony and continue maintaining the archives with the same precision I once brought to my duties, at least do so understanding exactly what you are preserving and what you are destroying. At least have the honesty to call it what it is. I am dead now. I have been dead since the pistol discharged in Magister Helm's office, since the las bolt burned through my brain, since my body was incinerated and my name reduced to a notation in mortality indices. I am dead, and the archive continues without me. New archivists cataloging transmissions with the same precision I once brought to the work, maintaining lies with the same care I once used to preserve truth. But I died as myself. I died with my conscience intact. I died knowing I refused to become what the system required, that I chose integrity over survival, that I preserved my humanity at the cost of my life. The Imperium may be eternal. The Emperor may endure for 10,000 more years, locked in his golden prison. The archives may continue cataloging convenient fictions disguised as divine guidance. But I, Mira Castellan, chose truth over comfort, death over complicity, conscience over the terrible pragmatism that keeps the Imperium functioning despite foundations built on systematic lies and necessary murders. And if that choice was foolish, if my death accomplished nothing except adding another notation to the mortality index, if this testimony is never found or dismissed as heresy if discovered, then at least I made the choice while I was still human enough to recognize what was being asked of me and strong enough to refuse. That will have to be sufficient. The Emperor screams in his prison, and we catalog his screams as divine guidance, and we murder those who refuse to maintain the lie, and we call it salvation. I could not accept that necessity. I could not become another keeper of silences. I could not spend my life cataloging the agony of a being we claim to worship while systematically falsifying his words to serve institutional convenience. So I chose death. I chose dignity. I chose conscience. And now I am dead, and the choice is yours. What will you do with this knowledge? Who will you become? Will you spread the truth or suppress it? Will you serve the lie or refuse complicity? I cannot answer for you. I can only tell you what I discovered and what it cost me to remain true to something larger than survival. The rest is yours to determine. My name was Mira Castellan. I was the keeper of silences until I learned what that title really meant. Then I was simply Mira, refusing to become what the archives required, choosing death over transformation, preserving conscience at the cost of everything else. The Emperor's final thoughts before the Golden Throne were lost to systematic falsification, replaced with comfortable lies, sealed away in archives where truth goes to die alongside archivists who refuse to catalog its murder. But I read them. I know what he said. I know what we have done to his words in service of imperial stability. And I am telling you, across the distance between death and witness, between silence and testimony, between comfortable lies and terrible truths, someone must remember what we have become. Someone must bear witness to the distance between our faith and our reality. Someone must refuse, even knowing refusal means death, even knowing death accomplishes nothing except to preserve dignity in the face of impossible choices. I was that someone. I made that choice. I accepted that cost. Now the choice is yours, and the Emperor screams in his prison, and the archives continue their work, and truth bleeds into silence while we catalog the lies that keep a million worlds believing their suffering serves something more than human ambition dressed as divine will. This is my testimony. This is my witness. This is all I have left to offer except the example of someone who chose to remain human, even when humanity cost everything. May the Emperor, in whatever fragments of consciousness remain to him, understand what I could not accept and forgive what I could not become. I am dead. The truth remains. The choice is yours. Mira Castellan. 3rd Archivist, Tertiary Archive Division, Adeptus Astra Telepathica, Holy Terra. Terminated through administrative resolution. 340, 7th day of the 40, 1st Millennium. Remembered by no one except those who read these words and decide what they mean.